Welcome, everyone, dear students, colleagues, guests. Welcome for joining in tonight. On behalf of the Department of Architecture and Urban Planning of Ghent University, I welcome you to the fifth online lecture in the series Excursion at Home. My name is Wouter Davids and I'm your host for tonight. And before introducing our distinguished speaker for tonight, the artist Ellen Harvey, allow me to say a few words on the lecture series that you're effectively tuning into tonight. Today, March the 4th, 2021, the COVID-19 pandemic has been with us for almost a year. I remember particularly well that a few days from now on last year, classes were not able to happen again in the auditorium, and I started recording my classes for my students. And it didn't really go away. We had a sort of a break over summer that we were released from lockdown, but we were back in it, maybe a lockdown light, but still since October last year, which meant that for an architecture program like ours, that was a major restriction. So all of the excursions that we normally plan throughout the year for the bachelor students within Europe and then the master students take like a yearly trip to more distant locations had to be canceled. That was a severe decision made by the department, but one that we did not take lightly, but we had to do in the end. But we decided to come up with a sort of compromise and see to what extent that traveling could be replaced by a different formula. And this lecture series is a compromise for not being able to travel, but we hope it's at least to some extent rewarding. So what we have been doing the past 4 times, and it's the fifth iteration tonight, is to invite speakers from distant places all over the world, friends and colleagues that we like and that we respect the work of, to bring us to places that they cherish and that they care about and they wish to share with us. And so using the new channels of communication, we have all become very practical in organizing these kinds of formats, although I think we're not particularly fond of it. I think it does the job. And for this series, I think it really does, because tonight our guest is speaking to us from New York, and she will talk. So the guest of tonight is Ellen Harvey, and she will talk about a project that I'll explain a bit in a minute. But in the past, we've had our guest taking us from Bayern, Germany and Switzerland to the Gold Coast in Australia, Sicily in Italy, and Cape Town in South Africa. And tonight, we're going to see different places, basically all over the world. And the fifth person to take us on a trip tonight, it will be a whirlwind trip, I imagine. I know my friend Ellen really well. I think it will be a whirlwind trip. She'll be addressing us from New York, but taking us to many distant places. Ellen Harvey is an artist, an American-British artist working and living in New York with a conceptual practice steeped in painting, or that's at least how I got to know the practice of Ellen. But it's a practice that is wildly prolific, if I may say so, going from painting to site-specific works, museum installation using mirrors, engraved mirrors, mosaic and glass, but all using different types of image typologies, often very traditional representational genres or painterly vocabularies such as the landscape and portraiture, using them to address wider issues, not solely painterly issues, but societal and larger worldly issues by applying those genres, often even literally, to sites in and of the world, to the built environment and different urban landscapes. Ellen Harvey's work belongs to many public collections around the world, and I'm just going to name a few to demonstrate the kind of scope of her practice, ranging from the Whitney Museum, the Hammer Museum, the Berkeley Art Museum, but also the Museum Centro Gallego de Arte Contemporanea in Spain, the Guangzhou Art Museum, and the Philadelphia Museum of Fine Arts, which, if I'm well informed, possesses a really large-scale installation of yours, Ellen. She's represented by Lux Gallery in Philadelphia and also the Gallery Maison de Klerk in Brussels. So some of you might have already had an opportunity to see some of the work of Ellen. In particular, she might be known to some of you for the work she made in the small town of Bosuit in West Vlaanderen, where she was engaged for een kunst in opdracht by the Vlaams Bouwmeester, where they, within the refurbishment of an old church, a ruin actually, Ellen was, her project was selected to make a mosaic on the floor of the church that contains a picture of the ruin of that very church after being bombed in the First World War. And it's a project that's very dear, as my family is from those environs in Flanders, is very dear to the people that live in that area. Tonight, Ellen is going to take us on a project I'm very eager to hear about, which is called the Disappointed Tourist Project. And in contrast to previous speakers who would take us to locations that still exist, I think Ellen will take us to places that no longer exist for many different reasons. So please, Ellen, the virtual floor is yours, and to the audience, sit back, relax, and enjoy the talk.
Thank you, Wouter, and thank you for inviting me. It is a pleasure to be in Belgium, though honestly, I'm a little sad not to actually be in Belgium because I always have such a great time when I'm there. So tonight I'm going to talk about The Disappointed Tourist, which is a project that I've been working on for about a year and a half now. And I'm also going to invite you all to take part in it if you're interested. But to give you some context, I'm also going to show you a few older projects that deal with related strategies and related subjects such as art and nostalgia, nostalgia for the built environment, the sort of attachment of meaning to the built environment, and also this question of use and uselessness and whether a useless thing is more artistic than a useful thing. Because I'm always jealous of all of you architects because you actually get to make things that are useful, whereas an artist, I'm condemned to endlessly make things that are totally useless. However, perhaps they can create some kind of narrative, and that's sort of my goal as an artist. Let me just set up screen sharing. Are we good? Excellent. So as an artist, my goal really is to create a conversation. I think art does not happen in a vacuum. Art is a social experience. And so you need people to talk about what you're doing. You need people to have a new thought. And so my goal generally for almost all of my projects is to try and seduce people into thinking, into reconsidering a narrative that they already perhaps consider to be fixed, to consider to be solid, or perhaps hold dear for some other reason. This strategy is one that really started with a project that I started, I think it was in 1999, when Mayor Rudy Giuliani was the problematic mayor of New York City, perhaps not quite as famously problematic as he is today. At the time, he was well known for jailing graffiti artists, and so there was a whole situation where he was, it was a clean streets, with the broken windows theory of policing, with the result that a lot of young graffiti artists were being put into jail. I thought it would be really interesting to see what happened if you changed both the demographic of who was doing graffiti. At the time, I was a young woman in my, I think I just turned 30. So I was a white woman in your 30s is really the best possible demographic to become a career criminal. And I also thought, what would be an interesting aesthetic, an aesthetic that would be easily assimilated by people who didn't like graffiti. So I came up with the idea of making landscape paintings. So here you have one landscape painting made in Highbridge Park, which was a park that had just been renovated by the time by the New York Renovation Society, or Renovation Project, which is actually where the title of this entire project came from. It ended up being called the New York Beautification Project, of course, making fun of this idea of urban renewal and beautification by inserting sort of often plants, in this case, landscapes into the world. So this was done in a park that was quite a dangerous park. They'd found they just renovated it. They'd found a headless, armless, legless torso in a bag while they were clearing it up. It was the kind of park where people went to have sex and strip cars. It was conveniently cut off from the local community by a highway, and you had to go through a tunnel to get into it. While I was painting this, a lot of people were having fun in the bushes. One of my favorite guys came out afterwards. He said, "How did you get this job?" He said, I said, "Well, I just did it." He said, "Really? How much are they paying you?" And I said, "Nothing." He said, "Man, you've got to get a better job." But, I didn't have, later ARD, who I tagged obviously on this, and this is a sort of little aspirational, terrible version of a Claude Lorrain that I painted there over 2 days. ARD tagged this, but I don't have a photograph of that because when I went through the tunnel to the park, of course I got mugged, and so I didn't have a camera after that. The park totally lived up to its reputation. But starting this, I thought it really is a project that can start to create a dialogue. If I start doing this on the streets, people will start to ask themselves, is this art? Is this graffiti? It existed very much as part of a conversation on the streets at the time. And people started writing about it almost immediately. It was very strangely eye-catching, despite the fact that the person whose mural I tagged here, his brother came, he was just like, "Man, it's too small. You can't even see it from a car. Like, where's your crew?" And I was like, "I know." He said, my brother now, he's got real jobs now. And I was like, "I know." So, "But you're doing it with respect, right?" And I was like, "Absolutely." So this question of respect in the public realm came up quite a lot. I got beaten up by the police when they mistook me for a homeless person. And then they realized I wasn't a homeless person. They immediately let me go, which tells you a lot about how great it is to be a white woman on the streets of New York. And the project kind of went on. I did end up doing 40 of them on the streets. It eventually became a book. One of my favorite things that the police said to me after they beat me up, they said, "Well, the mayor hates graffiti." And I said, "Yes." And they were, "Do you have permission?" And I said, "Well, the owner of this building is dead." And there was a sort of Kafkaesque moment where they sort of said, just go. And I left and I'm thinking, well, how do we know it wasn't his guy's dying wish that I decorate their building? But of course, at the end of this, it was all sort of weirdly vindicated in a truly horrible fashion when I made a map of this project, because every good public art project has to have a map so that you can see it. And somebody took the map, had a picture of one of the paintings on it, and gave it to Giuliani in a cigar bar. And he sort of said, "This is the kind of art the city needs," and signed it, which was sort of like being endorsed by the devil himself. But it did create this tremendous conversation in the public realm, which I then ended up writing a book about this question of who gets to be an artist, and this question of, what kind of aesthetics are allowed to be art. What kind of aesthetics can people agree on? And what happens when those aesthetics are actually quite reactionary, which I think is actually a more interesting thing than people often think. And this question of what people want, especially people outside of an art world, is one that sort of guided a number of different projects that I did subsequently. This is a project called The Irreplaceable Cannot Be Replaced that was made for Hurricane Katrina victims. There was an advertisement in the Times-Picayune, the local newspaper, and people could send in to say what they had missed, what they'd lost that was irreplaceable. And I made paintings as gifts for people and also exhibited their narratives. And they all came to the opening and took their paintings, and people were incredibly moved by the idea of symbolic restitution, which I had always poo-pooed. I have to admit, I'd always thought, well, what's the point of making something that's gone? It's gone. Right? Your partner has died because they ran out of electricity. I can't bring her back. And yet, for the person whose partner had died, having the portrait was meaningful, which was a thought that I ended up sort of sitting with for several years after this project, this sort of question of, what can I do as an artist to sort of actually address some of the things that are on my mind. Here you have somebody whose tools were a large part of their identity, who missed their tools. This is somebody whose house was destroyed. And this question also of how narrative gets attached to place and to objects is one that ended up informing a project that dealt with a place that you all probably know, the Citadel Park in Ghent. This is a project that I made for SMAC. where they kind of cheerfully said to me, well, you know, it has a very bad reputation, the park, Ellen. You'll love it. It's totally your kind of thing. And I thought, really, is it that bad? You know, so I went with my sort of baby at the time, and I was like, well, rains a lot, but it's not, that didn't seem particularly terrifying. And it made me think, since the show was about the idea of the picturesque, of William Gilpin, who wrote some of the earliest tourist guides in the English language, who all called things like observations relative chiefly to the picturesque beauty of the River Wye or various places. And I started to imagine, what if Gilpin had written a guide to the Citadel Park? Because most of his guides, you know, he tends to sort of show up somewhere, and then he says, oh, we arrived, but the weather was inclement. It was raining, so we left. You know, as a sort of modern tourist guide, it's completely ridiculous. He's constantly talking about how the trees are unhappily grouped together. You know, he has all these sort of rules which all have to do with experiencing the world as a picture rather than as a real place. And they're utterly ludicrous. I would highly recommend actually trying to read Gilpin, who is so unfashionable, and you will literally be on the floor completely in hysterics. So I thought, well, it would be great to see what, you know, Gilpin would think of the Citadel Park, which is, to be frank, not the most successful park. So here's Gilpin, and we made a booklet, which was a pastiche of Gilpin, which we then distributed to everyone living around the park. We translated it into Dutch, and then we offered tours of the park, discussing Gilpin's view using these 18th century handheld mirrors called Claude glasses that you use to admire the landscape. And this was one of the sort of moments when I realized that sometimes things do get lost in translation, because one of the first tours I gave seemed to be going swimmingly well. There were all the signs of the sites of particular natural beauty in the Citadel Park, and we would stop there and discuss them in terms of 18th century landscape aesthetics. And then we got to smack, and of course there was the archive of Gilpin's supposed trip to the Citadel Park, which could never have happened, since, you know, this was purportedly happened in 1790, and the Citadel Park was only built in 1913. But a lot of people seem not to have focused on this, and were deeply, deeply upset to realize that, in fact, it was not a real book by Gilpin about the Citadel Park, and that, you know, the paintings were not by Gilpin, they were all by me. And here's a shout out to the lovers of the Citadel Park, who I never got to see, but I heard they were there, so I put them in my archive of the Citadel Park. It was a good example of how careful you have to be to actually listen and not just talk all the time as an artist, because I had to do quite a bit of apologizing, because I didn't mean to obviously mislead anyone. I thought people had entered into it on this sort of spirit of fun, and instead there were people who were really quite sore at having been tricked in their opinion. So this idea of, you know, how people attach images and understand beauty and understand meaning in the built environment is something that, you know, has a relationship to painting, but you don't often think of it as being something that painting deals with today. And obviously I work in a lot of different media, and I'm showing mainly paintings here. But one of the things that I saw that I thought was the most perfect way of sort of showing paintings ever was this fantastic hot dog stand in Washington, DC. I mean, it's the most wonderful thing. So I thought, well, I too will make a hot dog stand. But my hot dog stand doesn't sell hot dogs. It sells hand-painted souvenirs of the ruins of Washington, DC. And this is for a future when the world has basically become a desert. You know, we've messed it up so badly that there aren't any people anymore, but extraterrestrials come and they speculate about the lost pillar builders of Earth. And they become very, very fond of classical and neoclassical architecture, basically like everyone else, like the fascists, like the Catholic Church, like, you know, sort of that, you know, you can find all these amazing different meanings that have been attached to classical and neoclassical architecture. If you're in Washington, DC, everyone immediately says, oh, well, it symbolizes democracy. But of course, having grown up in the UK, I said, oh, no, it symbolizes the British Empire. So we had this souvenir stand, and then we made guides for alien visitors. And of course, alien has a double meaning in the United States because it also means people who are illegally living in the country. This whole project was partly inspired by a very tragic story of a backpack found abandoned in the desert with a little card, a little green card, which is the residence card that you have. And it's called an alien residence card. And there's a little picture of a green alien on it, a little fake card. So we had this guide that tried to explain to alien visitors in the future, and it was in all the places in Washington, D.C. where you would get guides to the city. And these are all the main sites in the city, but they're all here shown as ruins. And the aliens are trying to explain what they were possibly for. And the aliens are pretty sure that there were 3 sexes of lost pillar builders of Earth, and they all lived in the ocean, and then they swam upstream once a year to have sex and build pillars together. They were obviously telepathic, because the pillars are all the same all over the place. I mean, there's no other explanation. And, the fact that the pillars are all the same size shows that it was a very egalitarian society. So this is all kind of carefully explained in this guide that anyone could have. It also had a very useless map of the city on the other side. And the aliens also collected postcards, which they had found, and they tried to arrange them like with like. So there are all these different things. There's a sort of, there's a Jewish synagogue that looks exactly like some sort of neo-colonial tomb that looks like a Grecian temple, which looks like a southern, slave plantation. They all look exactly the same, and yet, of course, they are all quite different. So this is this idea of a kind of narrative that that kind of attaches itself to places and attaches itself to architecture is particularly strong, obviously, with religious buildings, which are designed to be sort of narrative containers. This is where people get married. This is where people, christen their children. This is where you get buried when you die. These are places that, even when they're quite unprepossessing, like the Church of St. Amalberga in Bosseit, mean something to a place. They are not meaningless buildings, even when they're no longer wanted. So by 2009, there weren't enough parishioners anymore for this church, and the mayor decided to have an art competition to come up with ideas for what to do with the church. So when I went to see it in 2009, this is what it looked like. It's one of the many churches in Flanders that was rebuilt, obviously, after World War I. So while to me it seemed like a rather nice church, and most Americans would think of it as a lovely old church, it seemed to be, for people in the area, to be of minor historical value. This is St. Amalberga, supposedly after 1918, but there's some doubt as to whether this photograph is actually of the right church. There seem to have been quite a lot of churches in this state. So what I suggested was, having grown up in the UK where there are lots of ruined churches that people love, I said, well, we should just make it into a ruin, especially after we'd done a survey of the inhabitants who said they wanted more public space. So I decided to ruin the church. I had them take off the spire, take off the ceiling, take off the interior pillars to make this sort of outdoor communal space. But because obviously this had been a very important place, I made a terrazzo floor that shows both all the things we took out, all the different pillars and the altars, but it also shows the shadow of the previous church, which is why the piece is called Repeat. It's this idea that we're constantly building things, breaking them, reusing them, repeating them. Who knows? In 100 years, maybe there'll be a new church. Maybe there'll be something completely different that we can't even imagine. But there's this sort of cyclical aspect to ruins and to buildings that I wanted to sort of show. And I'm very happy to say that people actually are using it, which has been a great thrill to me, sort of for all kinds of different things. Teenagers have put on light shows, there have been concerts, even some people have got married there. So, and this last really silly project before we come to The Disappointed Tourist is just one of those sort of moments that made me think about how we use representations of places. This was actually a souvenir stand that I built for the streets of St. Petersburg, Russia. And St. Petersburg, Russia is one of those places that has this tremendous hold on the popular imagination, to the extent that there is a St. Petersburg in Florida. And so this is a souvenir stand for St. Petersburg, Florida. And it's obviously making fun of the idea of a sort of an international artist who kind of shows up somewhere, and they Googled where they were going, but they got it completely wrong. And you could take postcards. But the thing that was great was that people in St. Petersburg really loved the idea of this. This St. Petersburg's motto is actually the city of sunshine. So almost all the postcards said the city of sunshine, which, if you've ever been to St. Petersburg, Russia, is not exactly, it's one of the least sunny places in the world. So there were all these Russians who thought this was incredibly funny and charming, which was a really hilarious project to get to do. And it made me really think about, again, this idea of what people want. Like, what do people want? What can I do that can make people smile, make people rethink where they are and their relationship to where they are? And there's obviously a long tradition of this. And I started to think it would be fun to do something that used this tradition of tourist painting, which, obviously I used at a souvenir stand, but I love this idea that anybody could be like a sort of fancy tourist going on the grand tour, coming home with their canaletto under their arm. Or they could be somebody who wanted to see what, Egypt had been like, and would buy a cheap print by Turner, even though Turner never saw Egypt either. Or they would be somebody who, like, the Zattlers, who made these incredible paintings of famous places throughout the world, and then traveled, Europe with a specially made tent, so people could go and see the places that they couldn't see through these paintings, which, of course, while they're meant to be accurate, of course, also very, very personal. They're very handmade. And this handmade quality was the thing that I started to think about when I really wanted to make a project about nostalgia. The last years in the States, in particular, after the election of Donald Trump with his slogan, "Make America Great Again," really made me want to think, well, sort of examine this question of what people really meant by again. Like, what is it that people really, really miss? Like, what would they like to see? Because people, it's a very sort of simplistic idea that it's, people want, they want sort of, kind of some kind of racial hierarchy or sexual hierarchy that they were more comfortable with. They want a particular kind of economic organization they were more comfortable with. But often when you talk to people individually, you get very different answers. And I started to think, well, I wonder what would happen if you looked at this really carefully, or in a kind of mad way. I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to do any kind of representative survey, but I could do a project that could travel like the Zattlers paintings, but that could be constantly acquiring new places. And I thought it would be interesting to see what people actually miss. I bet you get some interesting responses. So I started off by making some sort of test paintings and making them into postcards and putting out postcards, and then emailing people and doing other kinds of outreach and giving talks and saying, just tell me, if, give me places. Is there a place in the world that you would like to visit or revisit that doesn't exist? And I wanted to see what would come in. And The Disappointed Tourist is that project. It's, at this point, I think I've painted about 230 sites. It's obviously a completely mad, completely non-scientific, can never be finished, sort of, massive sort of catalog of loss. And it's very strange. I think we're going to go through some of the sites now, and hopefully this will be something that will be kind of fun to think about, because you can all take part in it. The project's going to keep going until I've made 1,000 paintings. And at the end, there will be the website. So if anyone has a place that they want to add, they're very welcome to. And of course, this project has also taken on a very different meaning. It started off as being a project intended to create a conversation that kind of created empathy for I thought the idea that people, experience loss, people experience nostalgia, and that it's a trauma, and they experience it individually, and then they attach themselves to groups to make themselves feel better about it. And I thought, what if everyone can express their trauma and have it be recognized on a very individual and personal level, but then also see other people's trauma and see other people's losses, see what stories other people want to tell. And of course, in a time when we're in a way all disappointed tourists, because none of us can go anywhere, the project was also taking on this whole other life online, which is something that I hadn't anticipated. I hadn't realized that I would spend a year trapped in my studio communicating with the outside world as people told me things and places that they missed that don't exist anymore. So here are some of the paintings. This is going to be very fast. So this is the one category of which I have practically none. Nobody misses their school except for this one woman in Pennsylvania. This is the biggest category. So lots and lots of people miss amusement parks. They miss happy memories from their childhood. Some of these amusement parks are truly revolting looking. This one in Brooklyn, I don't think looks particularly great, but people have incredibly fond memories of them. This one is called Pleasurama, which I think is a really fantastic name. Rockaway's Playland. Flipper's Roller Boogie Palace was only open for a little while, but apparently it was like the place to go, and somebody went there for their birthday party and just never got over it. People even miss amusement parks that closed before they were born. So I have a whole, I mean, I could give this whole talk on amusement parks because there are all these ones where people write about, their grandparents' memories of various amusement parks. This is one for Mormons near Salt Lake City. The famous Luna Park of Coney Island. Swimming pools are also a huge category, it turns out. People, maybe it's the sort of sensory pleasure of being in the water, but there's something about swimming pools that a lot of people miss. Swimming pools, beaches. This is a beach in Istanbul that is now filled in. That little pavilion is actually in the middle of a parking lot now. These were these famous baths that Sutro built in San Francisco. It was an enormous complex. You can still see the ruins today. And it was sort of free public bathing for everyone. This one has a really amazing history because the Moskova pool was on the site of the old Blessed Savior Cathedral, Holy Savior Cathedral, which was then torn down. It was meant to become a new palace of the Soviets, but then they ran out of steel, and then they ended up making a pool, and they've now actually rebuilt the cathedral on top of it, which is actually the cathedral where Pussy Riot was arrested. So somebody missed this. People miss places to go gambling. A surprising number of people like gambling, as a non-gambler myself. So Las Vegas gets a lot of shout outs, but even like very humble ones, like this is one where you could play tic-tac-toe with a chicken in Chinatown. A surprising number of people were excited about this chicken. Sometimes people get together, I think, and they're just like, let's all submit the chicken. Yeah. So people miss sporting events. I have a lot of old arenas and stadiums. This is obviously the famous old Wembley Stadium, the Twin Towers. People miss drive-ins, so places that so a lot of these are places, this whole first sort of section are all places that people go with other people. And I think one of the reasons why maybe I got so many of them is that none of us can go to any of these places right now. So this is a cinema that somebody missed. People wrote really beautiful sort of essays about why they missed these places, which are all now on the website. So I encourage you to read them because I can't really do justice to them. But this apparently was the place to go. This guy, this is somewhere in Wales. This is like this unassuming cinema, and he used to go and watch horror movies. And now he's like, I'm a screenwriter for horror movies. It all started here. So here's the Mars Bar, which was a famous dive in the East Village. Apparently, it was so awful that when they tried to sort of have like a month-long kind of bash to close it, it got shut down early by the health department, which I think we were all glad we survived our experiences at the Mars Bar. But this is a famous gay pub in London where people wrote rather movingly about some of the encounters that they'd had there. And some places, are just sort of like there was a famous cafe in Salzburg at the top of the hill, and a lot of people. If you look it up, some of these places, you look them up, and then you find all these people on TripAdvisor being like, "My mother told me to go to Cafe Winkler, but it's not there." And you think, "Oh yes, or the Sunshine Cafe in Margate was another sort of, some of these places are coming back as well. This is actually being rebuilt now. And some of them are truly weird. This is a Tolkien themed restaurant of which I could find only a very, very bad image. So it's quite sort of blurry kind of painting. And some of them are quite, this woman wrote a very, very moving story about Joe Jr.'s restaurant, which doesn't appear to have been anything particularly special, but meant obviously a great deal to her. This is another restaurant by the sea in the UK. This restaurant was famous because it was shaped like a hat. So it was called the Brown Derby. And all these paintings are painted in black and white and then sort of quote unquote colorized. So they look a little bit like old postcards. They're all about, I don't know, let's say about this big. And this is not working with the thing, about this big. They're about as big as the screen, really. Anyway, so the Brown Derby, I'm sure, is probably brown, but I decided not to ever check any colors. So it would be like all those old postcards where you'd look at it and think, can it really have been that color? Because who knows? This is a relic of Cape Canaveral in Florida, the satellite motel, obviously from the time when all of these sort of space flights were a thing. The satellite fell down and it's not been operational since. Famous CBGB's, another sort of incredible dive place, but obviously the birthplace of punk in New York City. So that was one that quite a lot of people suggested. Places like Kim's Video, which was also a famous video shop, which has this whole, again, sort of these places have these sort of whole, their mythologies attached to them, where Kim's Video collection, he was raided because they were apparently pirated, and then he hid it all somewhere in Italy. It was a completely mad story. And sometimes they're just really boring. Like, this is just someone's local video store in the UK where they just missed going to the video store, I guess, or Tower Records in New York City. So some of these places are not particularly beautiful. I mean, some of them are. This is Cranbourne Alley. This is a little alley in Margate, a little old shopping street that somebody missed. This person wrote a really sad thing about filling in this ravine, which had these famous old bridges on it, where apparently all the poets and thinkers would meet up and get drunk in the Canary Islands. And it was this sort of moment of urban renewal that was really more urban destruction, in his opinion. Sometimes things have become obsolete, just because the times have changed. I mean, there's these sort of tiny local airport, or remember the days when we used to take the hovercrafts? There's an old ferry in Boston, the old airport, the Tempelhof Flughafen in Berlin. For some reason, this is a big favorite with kids. A lot of kids suggested the Titanic, and I was like, it's not really a place. But then I just gave in. Like, once the 10th child had asked me if I could paint the Titanic, I was like, it's a place now because it's not moving anymore, so it can be a place. Some people missed things that you wouldn't expect. So there's a power station in Kent that people submitted. People missed, to my surprise, not as much as I expected, but quite a lot of people sent in factories. This is the Packard car plant. This is an old brewery in Birmingham, often because they had worked there or family members had worked there. This is the headquarters of Bethlehem Steel. This is from somebody who'd worked at Bethlehem Steel in Pennsylvania. And then people also missed things that were artworks. They didn't just miss things that were there for fun or that were had some practical use in their lives. They also missed, in this case, somebody missed an outsider artist's installation that had gone. Rachel Whitread's house, which is obviously, it's kind of fascinating that it's here because it's a piece that commemorates a lost house, and then it's lost and destroyed in its turn. And the person who submitted it wrote this incredible essay about what it had meant to him at quite a hard time in his life and what it had been like to go and see it and how he felt about it not being there anymore. And sometimes people submitted artworks where I couldn't even really figure out whose they were. I couldn't find this artist. They were like this. Someone said, I walked past this, every day for years, and then it was gone. And this is the only photograph I have of it, and it's in the middle of a construction site. So I was like, okay. And sometimes people submitted things really because they were, fans of architecture. These houses were submitted by a retired gentleman who loves these gabled houses and has been mourning the loss of every gabled house he can find. So he wrote me this he sent me a huge array of photographs of these old houses, and a lot of sort of text about why each one of them was very special and how sad he was that they were gone. So I painted some of them for you. And other people sent in things that were quite famous architecturally. Some of the early skyscrapers of Chicago, for example, were missed by some people. Or people wanted to talk about like what Venice Beach had looked like when it was first developed, when it was first, designed, when it was built to be a kind of version of Venice, complete with gondolas. Most of these canals are now filled in. But there are still people who kind of wonder what it would have been like, would have liked to have seen that or liked to have visited it. So we start getting into this world also of things that people would like to have seen that in many cases they never saw. So things that happened before they were born. So it's not about the sort of personal connection to a place, but it starts to become more intellectual. So it starts to become more about, I wish I could have seen, the world's largest log cabin, which was apparently this forestry building in Portland, Oregon that caught fire. Or people who, are still mourning places that have been gone, but still seem, like a real loss to the urban fabric. Several people in Belgium sent in the Maison du Peuple. It seems to be sort of like Penn Station in New York, where people still talk about it. People still are sad that it's gone in many cases. And so you also get things obviously by other famous architects. This is a hotel that Frank Lloyd Wright built in Tokyo. Part of it is still preserved, but the hotel itself is gone. Or the Bavinger House that Bruce Goff built that was destroyed in 2016. Or the Hall of Nations by Rav Ruel in New Delhi, which is a sort of brutalist masterpiece that, somebody was like, you have to put that in. That has to, it's such a loss. It's got this sort of boring thing replacing it. Or Robin Hood Gardens, which are Alison and Peter Smithson's buildings. I think only one of them has been destroyed. I think the other one is still, it's on its way out, but one of them is definitely gone. So it got in. Or something, really sad, like the Glasgow School of Art. Several people suggested this after it burnt down, after they had just finished renovating it after a previous fire. And then some people just really wanted to see things that they never, ever could have seen. Like, so there were people, Troy, I had like 7 people who wanted to visit Troy. They were like, I always wanted to see Troy. It's a perpetual source of disappointment to me that I can't. And so there's Troy. Or somebody in Istanbul said, I really would have liked to have seen what the Hippodrome of Constantinople really looked like. So here it is, my best efforts. And sometimes people wanted to make a point. Some of these losses of antiquity are not just about losing a beautiful place. The person who wanted to see the Parthenon before 1803 didn't just want to see the Parthenon before it was, ruined. They also wanted to see it before the Elgin marbles had been stolen by Lord Elgin or taken by Lord Elgin, depending on your point of view. This person felt very strongly about it. And some of these buildings, it really is the narrative that the person was interested in. The Bastille in Paris, interesting architecturally, but obviously more interesting in a way as a site of history, as a place that had a kind of political meaning. Or the Crystal Palace, again, very sort of interesting in terms not only of the building, but also in terms of like imagining what it would have been like to go to see this exhibition in one of the first great glass buildings. What would that have been like? And sometimes people, claim to miss buildings, but you really suspect that they're going on about something else. Like Bonwit Teller, yes, it's true, it's very sad to have lost a neo-Baroque building in New York City. But to have lost these sort of beautiful friezes on the front, which But the person who destroyed them after promising them to the Met was, of course, Donald Trump, and Trump Tower is now on this site. So I suspect that person had a bit of an axe to grind. And something like Black Wall Street, which was the site of one of the great tragic race massacres in the US, where hundreds of Black people were massacred and their businesses destroyed. It's not necessarily the beautiful place that's missed. In some ways, what's I think missing is an alternative history where the terrible thing didn't happen, which is a very, very large category also of what people send in. So 621 Osage Avenue was where the city of Philadelphia firebombed the Afro-nativist MOVE collective that were living there, and they had a sort of armed standoff with the city. They were firebombed. Lots and lots of houses were destroyed, and quite a lot of people were killed, including children. You send in Grenfell Tower in London. Again, it's not necessarily about the building in this case. This is about using the project as a way of memorializing something terrible that has happened, a kind of economic injustice in terms of how the building was renovated that led to an incredible tragedy. And it's quite hard to paint something like this, because you think, God, this is, it's one thing to paint someone's happy childhood memory. It's another thing to paint something where people have actually died. And it's quite a sort of heavy responsibility. So this sort of idea that people start wanting to start using the project to memorialize places that symbolized lost stories is something that sort of became apparent quite early on as well. So along with all these sort of incredibly happy and charming things, I also got things like the Mormon temple, where the leader of the Church of Latter-day Saints was assassinated, and the temple was built down and burnt down, and the Mormons all had to flee to Utah. The Great Walls of Benin was sent in by someone, by a Nigerian woman, who wanted both to call attention to this incredible architectural feat that had existed, that a lot of people didn't know about, but also and also to sort of call for its preservation, because there's still bits of it left, but also to talk about the fact that it was destroyed by the British. That some of the scars of colonialism are not just live on physically in the world that we live in to this day. So like the Summer Palace, which the French and the British burnt down in 1860. There's actually a recreation of it in an amusement park now somewhere in China. Sometimes people wanted to talk about buildings that have been since rebuilt, like the Lachenhall in Ypres. In some cases because people felt they shouldn't have been rebuilt, because they should stay as memorials. Again, it's a very particular point of view. This is one of the things that's most interesting about this project, is you have so many different stories, and they don't always agree. They're very complicated. Like, this is a really strange story. This is a mosque that was built in Germany for Muslim prisoners of war after World War I, in an attempt to convert Muslims to the German side. And so there's this, they built a whole mosque for these prisoners. And obviously World War II has a lot of victims architecturally that people sent in. So I got quite a lot of synagogues. This is the Great Synagogue of Warsaw, which was personally blown up by some Nazi in retaliation for the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. This is the Michelsberg Synagogue in Wiesbaden, which was a victim of Kristallnacht. The Hirschfeld Institute was one of the first institutes to study sexuality, in particular gay sexuality, and was obviously did not survive the Nazi period. It's a really fascinating history and very sad. The Royal Theatre in Malta, which has actually since been sort of remade into a theatre by Renzo Piano. Again, some of these places are places that disappeared and people never really forgot about it. And this sort of idea that a lost building can really live on in this really painful sometimes way is something that I found really interesting. This is a local church that got bombed where 5 people died. St. Michael's Coventry is still a ruin to this day. It was bombed in the Blitz. And then you have the Frauenkirche in Dresden, which was bombed, and many people felt was bombed in retaliation for the assault on Coventry. And now, of course, has been built up again. This question of whether a thing, this person, they didn't really want to see the old church. They wanted to make the point that maybe it shouldn't have been rebuilt, or maybe and the point that maybe the British shouldn't have bombed it. I mean, both of those, the sort of narratives that come along with these stories are really never simple. Hiroshima Castle, which has been rebuilt and is now a museum of the history of Hiroshima, but obviously, was destroyed in the atomic bomb. This is a temple in North Korea that was bombed by the Americans. Here we have that, we have Famagusta in Cyprus, which has been an abandoned ghost town. Now it looks like it might be being opened up by the Turkish in contravention to various agreements. Again, you look at the picture and you see, the ultimate, like, oh, it's a beach. It's a lovely beach. I'd love to go there. But in fact, of course, the person who sent it in had a larger point to make. This was a very famous mosque in Bosnia that was destroyed during the war. Again, these got a lot of, some of these very famous sort of architectural or cultural atrocities got a lot of people submitting them. Like, the Bamiyan Buddhas were sent in, I don't know how many times. The World Trade Center, obviously, again, a lot of people sent it in. But I'm not sure it was so much about the buildings. I think with the Buddhas, maybe it was about how beautiful the Buddhas were. And so you have some sort of a lot of things that recently happened, where people recently lost buildings in traumatic ways due to war or other kind of forms of conflict. A lot of those buildings made it in as well. So this is this beautiful mosque in Samarra that was destroyed in the Iraq War. Some Islamic extremists destroyed this beautiful Sufi shrine in Timbuktu. This is a mosque that has the nickname the Hunchback, because it looks like it's bowing, or the idea was it would bowed as Muhammad ascended into heaven. This was sadly destroyed by ISIS, who had been made it their headquarters. Sometimes you have these very strange stories. This is from the Arab Spring, where the Institut d'Egypte, which is a sort of library, was accidentally set on fire during the Arab Spring, and then sort of clashing. There were some people who were clashing in the streets, actually saved a whole bunch of the materials. They all worked together, even though they were on different sides, to try and save this building. They didn't save the building, but they did save some of the archive. This was a monument that had been erected by the government in Bahrain and then was destroyed by the government in Bahrain when it became a site for people to protest as part of the Arab Spring. And then, of course, there was sort of the very sad destruction of Palmyra by ISIS. I got, of course, people sent in, this is an olive grove that was bulldozed by the Israeli army in Israel. At the same time, I also got the Temple of Jerusalem. There are a lot of places that people, I'm not sure, always wanted to visit, even though all of these places in some ways are kind of touristy as well. It's a very interesting thing to think about. This tower in Kathmandu was a famous tourist attraction and then it was felled by an earthquake, killing, sadly, lots of tourists. Or the Palais National in Haiti, which was also destroyed in the sort of earthquake of 2010. Again, it is a tourist destination. This is what's sort of fascinating to me, is that these are the kind of places you would have visited and you would want to visit. And yet, in some ways, I can't help thinking it's not about wanting to visit it, but about wanting it just still to be there, wanting things not to have got broken, wanting people not to have fought. And of course, the last category of things are things that have disappeared due to climate change. This is a glacier that just disappeared entirely in Bolivia in 2009. Somebody wrote in who'd remembered skiing there, but it's completely gone now. This is a tree in the Calaveras Great Trees Park that fell over in a big storm. This is a bridge that caught fire in the Camp Fire. This was the most destructive fire ever in the US in 2018. It was an old covered bridge that's gone. And then, of course, people build new things, and sometimes, paradoxically, people prefer the old ones, or maybe they just have fond memories of them. So I don't know whether people prefer the bathtub, but I know there's somebody out there who has nostalgic feelings for the Sandberg wing. And in New York, the very, very successful Highline Park, lots of people love that park, and yet somebody else sent in a picture saying, I really missed it before it had been improved. I missed it when it was just wild and there were just syringes and random things growing there and you had to climb up to get there and it was this magical place when you were there. And I don't like it now that it's all, full of people and made accessible. People are perverse. You try to make something beautiful for them. Sometimes they love it, sometimes they don't. But in the end, when this project is finally shown, and hopefully it'll be a book as well. And right now, of course, the website functions sort of as a book. The whole point is to say people miss a lot of different things. There are a lot of different ways in which people relate to their built environment. And that going forward, it's worth thinking that all of these different narratives and all of these different ways that people kind of attach to the built environment are worth bearing in mind. There's a way in which it's a mistake to think that nostalgia is ever simple. Nostalgia is just as complex and strange as people are. And for a very sad project, it has been a surprisingly kind of encouraging project as well, because that sort of feeling that you get from people that they care about place, that they want to look after things, that they're interested in building or in rebuilding, is something that has really meant a lot to me, especially during the last year, and the kind of community it's created of people who are interested in our world and the built part of it. So if I am now done talking, because that is slightly longer than I meant it to be, but if anyone has any questions, I would be very happy to answer them. I'm going to undo my screen sharing. And again, if you want to suggest a place of your own, just go to www.disappointedtourist.org. It can be anywhere in the world. It can be anything. It can be a tree. It can be anything you like, just as long as it's not there and you wish it weren't.
Thank you, Alan, for this, as I suspected, whirlwind tour.
It's a lot of things, yes.
I can ask the audience, those who are not in a compromising situation and wish to share their screen, to switch on the cameras to have a bit of a view of who's with us tonight. And I'm happy to, I'm seeing some old student faces, which I'm happy to see. Welcome. If there are any questions, that you can address them directly to Alan, or if you want to put them in the chat, I can direct them to her as well. So please. Michiel, is there a place that you've included out of your own choice, a place you miss yourself, Alan?
Well, there's one place that I did put in that I put in because it's the place that I met my husband, but also about 10 other people suggested it. So there isn't a place that I've just picked all on my own. No, I mean, I may at some point, but I don't really have time because it's quite a lot of work to paint this many paintings. And it's not really about me and my subjective interests. So I think it would be boring. I mean, if it was too many things for me, it would be a bit boring. So I'm allowed to put things in that I've wanted, but I have to wait for somebody else to come up with it.
Continuing on that question, is there one, because there's of course an ethical question involved, you know, because I was thinking, I'm just going to make it very concrete. We have a camp called the Brindong camp in the vicinity of Antwerp, the periphery, where people go and commemorate the deportation of Jews, or other go there to commemorate other aspects. And so you have places that are contested and longed for. In this case, one still exists, but you could come up with places that might be for ethical reasons not acceptable at all. Did you refuse any?
So far, I haven't, but I do say in the invitation on the website that I'm not promising to do everything. And yes, there are some things where I might say, you know what, if this is really about celebrating an atrocity, I'm just not going to go there. And yet at the same time, I realize that many of these stories do have, there's often more than one point of view. And you could say, well, is that, I struggled when somebody submitted Grenfell Tower, because I thought, is this sort of a thing where am I voyeuristically recreating a tragedy here? And yet at the same time, I also thought, well, you know what? I think I can respect the desire to make this tragedy visible, to say this is and that desire is part of this project. So there are definitely, there are quite a lot of places that are tragic, where terrible things happened, and where the project is about memorializing the tragedy and taking that tragedy seriously, which seems odd in a project that is also obviously about sometimes people's very happy memories of places and places that they love. Which I think is a good way of thinking about the fact that when you say people miss something, that's much too simplistic to really sort of say what they actually miss. What do you maybe you miss, in many cases you miss the physical place, but you also wish the terrible thing hadn't happened. So it is quite ethically complicated. In general, I'm trying to include pretty much everything, unless, sometimes it's like, I've already got so many New York bars, I don't need necessarily more New York bars. So I don't always take everything. But there are moments, when you sort of sit there and think, okay, this has got to be a really good painting at least. And writing the entry in the website is going to be difficult to make sure that the tone is respectful and this tone is correct. And yet at the same time, it is meant to be a project where you bounce around and you think, wow, when people say they miss a place, that actually is not a simple thing at all. It is complicated. So I don't know whether I'm getting it right. We'll see. And it's hard to know. Behaving ethically, you always try, but you do your best.
And I'm waiting for another question to arrive. In the meantime, I might ask another one. Does it also have to do with the type of image you make? Because these paintings resemble postcards, which is a very specific typology of image carrier. And do you because the tower in London, indeed, I can see that the postcard might not immediately be the right image type to commemorate, but you might wish to do so. So do you experience, because you particularly choose one medium and one type of image to mobilize this whole series of places, how has been your confrontation with that particular image and medium you've chosen throughout the project? Did you at some point regret having chosen painting, for example?
No, I think painting actually is actually a very good medium for this, because you're physically remaking something. So there's a level of effort, like you're physically working. it's not just like a picture. It's really is. And so the painting of Grenfell Tower, for example, is intended to look almost like a tombstone. It's a very somber painting. It's one of the least colorful ones. And I get to make decisions. I can make the painting look the way I want. This idea, within the sort of vernacular of being a postcard, there aren't any people in any of these paintings. So they're depopulated, all of them. They're just the place, and they're really intended to be thought-provoking. I mean, meant to give you space, and also to think, well, somebody else took this thing that was missed seriously enough to remake it, to try and put us in a way. It's in a way, if you put yourself in a sort of room entirely filled with these, you're in a room of things that people wish for, in a room of things that people wish in a different world, in a world where a lot of things survive that haven't survived, where things that are broken are mended or still exist. So that's the idea, is that you could, I can't fix any of this. I can't make any of these places come back to life, or the people who've died and some of them come back to life. But I can make something that sort of honors that experience. I hope.
Yeah, I think Johan's question ties into this. He asked to what extent you deal with the tension between individual memory and more collective types of memory, because one of the things that came to his mind when listening to your talk is the notion of a Horace lieu de mémoire, so like a place of memory and commemoration. So is there, like, how do you deal indeed with this distinction between personal, private memory and collective memory?
Well, I'm not, because the question is quite an open one. So the idea is to see what, whether people see it as a sort of, whether what they want to see is something that they've already seen before and that they've experienced before, that they see as being somehow their own, being something that they own in some way emotionally, or if it's about them seeing themselves as part of a history, and or about saying, well, this project, I can use this project to show something, to tell a history that's been forgotten, or maybe a history that I think people are not thinking about enough. So the project is meant to operate on all of these levels. It's not meant to be about personal memory. It can, from the beginning, it was clear that, I mean, you could just have it be people's personal memories. I mean, I don't prompt people one way or the other, but what I was interested in is people's sort of narrative and emotional relationship to places that they can't go to. And the reasons for that can be so different. So I wanted to see all of those. I felt it was interesting to see, when we talk about people missing a place, it really, again, we often talk about it in this collective category of, well, people miss this. But in fact, people, when you look at them individually, some people really do see themselves as part of history, or some people just want to be tourists and see what Troy looked like, or other people really want to go back to their childhood. People vary a great deal, and I think that was sort of the idea of doing the project this way, was just to sort of see what happened. It's a completely mad project, and obviously it's totally dependent on who takes part, which again is something that I can't really control. I'm trying to, I'm starting now to do more and more outreach, but it's, I've had people from all over the world, and then I've had a lot of people from New York and a lot of people from the UK. So it's in some ways it's doomed to failure, because it can never be comprehensive. It will always be missing things. There will always be stories that are missing. There will always be opinions that are missing. And at the same time, I think that's the human condition, is to sort of start to listen to the complexity of people's stories and people's narratives. I think is actually a really great place to start, to say, well, I miss this, but this person misses that. And it's to put yourself in somebody else's shoes just for a moment. And I think that's actually really important. That's something I value.
There's another question by Robbie asking, because one of the terms you often use is the term narrative. and narratives can be invented as well. So we ask whether there places have been suggested that actually never existed, but only in fiction, as in movies or books, and that people might miss even in that respect. Like, is fiction also part of your enterprise, your mad enterprise?
It started to be, actually, because somebody suggested Atlantis, and that was a really difficult one. I was like, oh God, do I do Atlantis? And then I got the Land of Leoness, so I was like, okay, now it's a new category. So yeah, I do have people who want these sort of utopian places, and people are also I've started getting some that are very kind of abstract. I got somebody who sent in a world without plastic, or so, and then one woman sent me a place that she wanted to visit that was in a film, but then she couldn't find she thought it was a real place. Then she wrote back to say it was in a film. Then she couldn't find a picture of it. So we never really quite established what was going to happen with that one. So, because most of these do involve quite a lot of back and forth with the person, because I have to find an image, I have to make sure it's the right one. At the beginning, there were some sort of difficult moments when I'd paint something and they'd be like, oh no, I didn't mean that one. You'd be like, what? So so I've decided that that fictional places are also a possibility. Just not that many people have suggested them, but there have been a couple.
And there's a question by Tilke about these findings on the stories that people tell, because you actually discover the kind of rationale or different reasons behind the stories why people submit a photograph or a place. Will you include those in the project as well, if I'm phrasing the question right, Tilke? Like, because you have the story that people tell that send you the stories they send.
Those are all in the website. So the website has, and which hopefully one day maybe will be a book, but it's designed so you can look up any one of the sites, and there's a sort of my attempt at a very bare bones description of what the place is, because obviously in many cases people won't know what they're looking at, and they don't know. Each of the paintings has the place, the name, and the date of destruction, or the date when it closed or ceased functioning in some way. But there's a sort of, I sort of wrote a little Wikipedia paragraph basically for each one of them on the website, and then where people chose to, and not everyone wanted to write about why they submitted something, but where people chose to, then they wrote in some cases quite moving essays about why they picked this site or why this site was important. So if you go on the website and you click on any of the images, you'll find both the description written by me, which, please be kind and forgiving, because I'm not a historian, and I'm sure I got plenty of things wrong, and then people's submissions. So I thought about having people's submissions, but then it turned out that in many cases, people have quite a lot to say, but then there'll be very basic questions that, if you were going to look at this, you'd be like, well, what did this used to be? Or what was it? And that wouldn't be included because the people would assume that you knew. So I ended up having to and I didn't want people to have to endlessly be going, Googling every single site. And in some cases, it's quite hard to find out information about places. So I did the work for you to the best of my ability.
Yeah, there's a question, a perceptive question by Louise asking why you did not, or at least we didn't see any people, humans, or bodies included on the postcards, because it works very strongly in this narrative, because the postcards seem more tragic and eerie, and it makes them feel the buildings incomplete without their occupiers, as if they miss us too. So was that a kind of deliberate choice from the start?
Yeah, I didn't. Yeah.
Humans, yeah.
No, I think if you put in people, you have a couple of problems. Like, one of them is that the human eye and the human brain prioritizes people. So, if you look at a picture with people in it, the first thing your brain will focus on, maybe not for you if you're all architects, but for most people, the first thing that they'll look at are the people. And so the people will stick out. And then people also, the way they dress, the way they look, tells you a lot about the time. And I wanted to put all these things on a sort of level playing field. So I wanted it to have a slightly timeless feeling or anachronistic feeling. But I also felt like how, then you really, putting in people adds a whole different feeling to it. I did want it to feel elegiac. I mean, it is meant to be it is in many ways a sad project, even when it's dealing with very sort of happy memories in some cases. It's, it's a project about loss. It's a project about the trauma of even just the ordinary loss of your youth. That's a sad thing for many of us, for many people. And so I wanted it to sort of honor that. And also this way you can insert yourself into the place. Like you are the tourist. You're the person looking at it. You're the person who, wants to go to this place, so that you can sort of do a self-insert. And that's not so easy if you put people in. And putting people in just does add a whole, it just is very complicated, like who you put in, what they look like. It complicates the narrative in a really intense way, I think. So I thought it was better not to.
I think there's another provocative question by Eva asking if any architect or designer.
No, I haven't got that. That's a great question. Like, nobody has sent in, no architect has sent in a building that they designed that was never built, and no architect has sent in a building that they built that was destroyed either. I have had quite a lot of architects who took part, and they have all sent in other architects' buildings, being very supportive of other architects. So.
I think we have time for one or two more questions if people have still pressing matters to ask Alan. Well, I think we already had a really nice round of questions that your talk provoked. I think within the lineup we've had so far, this was a different talk, but I think touching upon many things that are at stake in the other talks. It's about the longing and the wish and the attachment you have to places, and motivations to travel, motivations to leave your own locale or your own place. And I think by bringing all these places together, and I think what I also really took, particularly from your last answers, is the importance of the type of image and your own mediation through painting. I think there's a lot happening in the images themselves, which we might not at first see, but I think by having you explain them, and I think I will have another look at them to see what is happening in the mediation itself. I think there's a really importance to that practice. And maybe one last one, because it was one of the first things I had when you talk. What about multiplicity? A lot of your projects, it's about many postcards, many paintings. So you rarely seem to make something that is singular, like it's always in the plural. And what's the importance of making things in the plural?
I think that as an artist, you have not a very big public voice, but you have a small public voice. And in some ways, I'm not very interested in my own voice. I mean, obviously I am, because otherwise I wouldn't be an artist. But I'm more interested in what other people have to say. And so I like making projects that have a lot of, sort of include a lot of different conflicting points of view that kind of resist a unitary narrative, because that way I think it's more seductive for people. I want everyone to feel that they could be part of this story. Like everyone could be, you could have an idea and you could send it to me, and then your point of view will be represented too. I think that's something that I can do as an artist. I can amplify people's voices, and I can also take. I just sort of prefer. I find it more interesting to listen to other people than to listen to myself. I already know myself. I know what I'm going to say. I know what I think, and what other people think and other people have to say is more surprising to me. And I also think that we prioritize what we consider to be sort of important people speaking in our world. And I think that giving other people a platform and in some ways taking other people's views seriously is a really good way of, I don't know, maybe I'm an optimist, but I'm certainly an idealist of giving people, of, I don't know, creating a world where everyone has a stake. I think that, you know, I'm very sincerely trying to show what people in this case miss. The results are sometimes ludicrous, sometimes they're problematic, sometimes they're difficult, sometimes they're things that I don't miss, sometimes they're things I would miss. But they're much more surprising and much more interesting than if you sat me down in a room and said, Ellen, what do you miss? That's just not, I mean, I already know that. There's no fun for me in that. And I also just don't think that I'm that interesting. I think collectively, sort of a collective of individuals, I often think is more interesting than a collective, any kind of community. I just enjoy, maybe I'm just a sort of classic liberal in the sense that I enjoy hearing lots of individual voices. And I like this idea that there isn't just one meaning, there isn't just one way that you can understand it. I like things that are complicated, but I also like them to be very accessible, and I like them to be seductive. I mean, the whole goal is to seduce people into thinking.
There's another question came in from Louise asking, so you started mapping the projects like the New York Beautification Project, and do you feel like all the postcards will be representative of various cultures, countries, and times? What are you missing, or from where would you like to have more submissions, or is that a question at all?
Oh no, it's actually a real question for me. Like, I'm very interested in. I'm resigned to the fact that I can't control, but I can push a little bit. So I'm obviously, I have too many things from New York. I have too many things from the UK. Like, I'm bored with I'm bored with them. It's just So I am very interested in people from countries where I don't have very many submissions. Parts of the world I don't have. I'm starting to get more things from Africa, which I didn't have really very many at the beginning at all. I was like, and it's a function of where I am, who I know, who knows me, how the project has been disseminated so far, what communities have started to learn about it. So, suddenly you'll have, somebody will know about it in one place, and suddenly there'll be like 10 things from one place. So it kind of, it's hard to, you can't really control it, but yeah, I mean, at this point, I'm starting to have more submissions than I can paint. So I prioritize things that are not from places where I already have a lot of things. So because I don't want it to be just Europe. That would be boring. I don't want it to be just America. It's just boring. There are a lot of really interesting things in the world that, and this is one of the things we've all learned, I think, during the pandemic, is that, dreadful though all the physical separation is, the sort of virtual connectivity does, which obviously has real economic limitations, but still does allow people to participate in things like this. So it's been quite a good project for that in a way. But yeah, there are lots of places that I'm just like, oh, I don't have anything from there. I wonder, do I know anyone who knows anyone there? That was their mother, So I definitely, I'm trying. It's completely mad because it will never be comprehensive. Whenever the paintings are shown, there are always going to be paintings that are unfinished to indicate that the project is one that necessarily is a failure. It can never be comprehensive. It can never show everything. It's just completely. It's just what sort of came my way. I'm one person, but I'm trying to show a lot of different people's points of view.
Then I think I might contradict you on your second last response, that you might not be the most interesting person to listen to. That might be your opinion, but I might fully disagree. Thank you, Alan, for what I think was a very thought-provoking and talk, but also one that is moving. I think there's a very deeply moving aspect to what you're trying to do, and the kind of embedded failure of, or the acknowledged failure of it, I think is an inherent quality of what we're trying to achieve. So thank you for sharing it with us, and thank you to the audience for tuning in tonight. The next talk will be in last week of March, first week of April, by Tina de Gent, taking us to unknown places in Ghent, but the date still is pending. So I'll keep you in the dark for a little while, but we'll communicate to you when that will take place. And then we have 2 more talks after Easter by Modbus Kruger about the warehouse Piaget in the first kind of big warehouse in Paris. And then we'll festively conclude with our Professor Emeritus Paul Robrecht, who will take us to Bangladesh. So I think we still have some beautiful prospects of traveling online in the future, and I hope to see you back then. So thank you for joining us tonight, and see you soon. Take care, stay healthy. Bye.